Hey everyone, What If Fan here, bringing you another exciting part of What If a Venerated Soul Reincarnated in Danmachi world. You can find the fanfic title and the original author's name on my Patreon page. Make sure to check it out and show them some love. If you enjoy the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Also check out my Patreon channel for early releases of all the series, where you can find all the series released one day ahead of YouTube. Alright, let's jump into it. Chapter 141, Judas Spade, I Hate You. A day had passed since the incident with the plant monsters. It was sometime in the afternoon, and Judas, Ace, and the others were having lunch when a gate guard approached them and snapped into a salute. Everyone, pardon my intrusion. More sacks of Valis are being delivered at the gates. The guard spoke with a respectful tone. Being in the presence of multiple first-class adventurers and executives warranted such an attitude. There's still more? I thought the last batch was the end. Tiona exclaimed in disbelief. Of course, the money being delivered was the compensation Judas had managed to squeeze out of the Freya familia. It seemed that even for Freya, transferring such an enormous sum took time. Freya could have written a check and transferred all those assets to another account. After all, Orario has a banking system designed to handle such matters. But Freya refused to do so, and there was a reason why. Hearing the guard's words, Finn raised his head, stared at the guard, and nodded. Raoul, like always, gather everyone and help out with the haul. Yes, Captain. Raoul replied with a salute. Amidst all of this, Judas grabbed a cup filled with water and drank it. After setting the cup down and finishing his meal, Judas rose from his seat. Excuse me, he said calmly. His nonchalant attitude toward receiving such a large sum of money made the others sitting at the table shake their heads. I'll come with you, Ace said almost immediately, standing up as well. Hey! Don't forget to give us our split. Loki shouted with her mouth still full of food, bits flying out and causing Riveria to furrow her brow in disgust. Yeah. That was all Judas said before walking out. There was an agreement between them to split the money being delivered. 60% would go to Judas, while the other 40% would be deposited into the Loki Familia's shared account. Of course, Loki tried to bargain for a higher percentage, but when she did, the only response she received was a quiet stare from Judas, as if he were saying, "You already got enough." This is my money. Loki responded with a stare of her own, as if saying, come on. We're a familia, aren't we? Sharing is caring. Judas replied with yet another stare that clearly said, I've already shared enough. Don't be greedy. In the end, it turned into a silent staring contest between the two until Loki's eyes turned red and she finally gave up. They reached the gates shortly after. Several dozen large sacks sat neatly stacked atop a couple of carts, each sealed and reinforced, the unmistakable weight of Valis evident at a glance. A few Freya Familia members stood nearby, their expressions tight and visibly restrained. Except for the person at the front, who wore a hood that covered her face, though Judas could still see the faint smile beneath it. Judas shifted his gaze and saw Raoul and a few lower-level members already hauling the sacks from the carts and transferring them into the mansion. As they passed each other, Raoul, carrying several bags of Valis over his shoulder, gave a nod of acknowledgement to Judas and Ace. Judas returned the gesture before turning his attention back to the Freya Familia at the gates, particularly the hooded woman at the front. Freya, you don't have to come each time you deliver the money. It's become pretty obvious at this point that you're using this as an excuse to visit the Twilight Manor, Judas said to the hooded person, already aware of her identity. For some reason, Ace took a step forward, her eyes showing a wary expression, but she didn't say anything. Oh dear, you're mistaken. I simply want to make sure the money is delivered safely and without a hitch, Freya replied as she removed the hood from her head, staring directly into Judas' eyes. I'm pretty sure that anyone with a brain wouldn't even attempt to rob the Freya Familia in the middle of the city. Unless they have a death wish, that is. Judas said with a neutral expression, crossing his arms. I suppose so. Freya said with a light giggle. As they conversed, Judas noticed that the carts were almost empty. Raoul and the others were remarkably efficient with their work. "Unfortunately, your business here is finished, Freya," Judas said, signaling the end of their interaction. "Yes, see you tomorrow, my otter." Surprisingly, Freya didn't press the matter and merely smiled. From her words, it seemed there was more money to be sent tomorrow, and that Freya would pay another visit. The amount she sent is much lower than last time. Which meant one thing. She's doing this on purpose to visit more often. Judas sighed but didn't speak up about it. As long as Freya kept her end of the deal, there were no grounds for him to complain. With a snap of her fingers, a fancy carriage appeared out of nowhere. Judas watched as Freya turned around and entered the carriage with graceful steps, but not before deliberately swaying her hips as she glanced back to gauge his reaction with mischievous eyes. When she saw that his expression remained unchanged, Freya wasn't the least bit disheartened. Instead, she blew him a kiss with a wink before taking her seat inside the carriage. Judas then shifted his gaze to the gray-haired woman who always seemed to be by Freya's side. From the start, her gaze had been locked onto him with deadly precision, never leaving his figure from beginning to end. Her name was Horn, and he later found out that she possessed an ability that allowed her to change her appearance into Freya's, and even granted her access to some of Freya's abilities, such as her divine charm. A unique transformation magic that could fool even the gods, and for a time, had fooled Judas himself. And that wasn't all. It also allowed her to share her thoughts and emotions with her goddess, which for most would be considered a drawback, but for Horn, it was a blessing. Judas spade. Horn said in a voice that carried both coldness and warmth. "I hate you." That was all she said before turning around and following Freya into the carriage. "Is this the fourth time?" Judas mused as he tapped his chin. An extremely loyal fanatic. He analyzed what kind of person Horn was, a conclusion drawn from their frequent encounters. Her reverence for Freya had led her to develop deep hatred toward Judas, sensing how much his presence had changed her goddess. However, due to their shared connection, she had also begun to develop affection for him, as Freya's feelings inevitably spilled over. Which led to her hating and loving him at the same time. Judas Spade heard her declaration and merely shrugged. It wasn't the first time she had said those words, and honestly, he found Horn's character peculiar. Well, whatever. He didn't dwell on it. Later in the day, Tiona, who had just visited the Goibnia Familia smithy, approached him with her giant double-bladed sword, Urga, in hand. "Hey, Judas, want to spar?" "Sure, why not?" He accepted without hesitation. Chapter 142, The Venerated One vs. Crusher Part 1. In the Loki Familia's training ground, Judas, who sat in a meditative pose, gathered mana around him as a magic circle shone on the ground. "One step closer to repairing my mana core," he thought as wiped the sweat from his brow. It was a daily routine that he made sure to perform every day. He hasn't forgotten that his main priority was to restore his original strength. After a few hours, he finally stood and stretched his body after sitting still for too long. It was then a certain Amazon walked up to him with a bright smile. "Hey, Judas, want to spar?" Judas shifted his gaze and saw Tiona staring at him, holding her giant sword, Urga. "Sure, why not?" He accepted without hesitation. In Loki Familia's courtyard, Ace could be seen walking towards a tree and unsheathed her weapon. "After getting repaired from Goibnia's smithy, let's try out my new sword," she thought as she closed her eyes, felt the weight of her sword and got into a stance. Sharpness. Balance. Swordsmanship. Her thoughts sank down deep within her mind and a memory surfaced. The image that she saw in her mind was her father, Albert Waldenstein, performing a series of sword moves in front of her as little Ace, and her mother clapped happily, visibly impressed. "See this, my little Ace?" Albert said as he swung his sword. His skill as the mercenary king wasn't just for show. Even when compared to a monster like Althea, Ace didn't think he would lose, not by a long shot. And it wasn't even because she was biased, but Ace truly believed this to be the truth with her experience as a swordswoman and as an adventurer. With his back turned, his scarf fluttering in the wind, young Ace back then couldn't help but think of him as the coolest person in the world. Father. Mother. She took a deep breath just as Leaf fell from a tree branch. The moment the leaf was within range, Ace opened her eyes and her sword arm moved at blinding speed. Sword arcs cut through the air and the leaf was cut into hundreds of different pieces. With a loud exhale, Ace put the sword back into the sheath as she turned her head to see Lafia staring at her in awe, hiding behind the tree. Miss Ace, that was amazing. Lafia's gaze was full of admiration as she watched her idol in action. Thank you? Ace said while tightening her head. Lafia, who still had sparkles in her eyes as she gazed at Ace, suddenly shook her head as if she had remembered something. Oh right. Miss Ace, you have to come to the training grounds. Sir Judas and Tiona are about to have a spar. Lafia said with excitement. The way Lafia addressed Judas' name had changed, there was more of a respectful tone to it, but Ace wouldn't notice as her attention was immediately captured when she heard the word spar. Judas and Tiona, sparring. Ace blinked and then immediately turned around to head to the training grounds. Ah! Ace, slow down! Lafia exclaimed as she tried to catch up. When Ace and Lafia arrived, the first thing she noticed was that a small crowd had formed. Members who happened to be in the mansion at this time had stopped whatever they were doing to watch the spar. After all, witnessing the sparring match of powerful adventurer was a rare occurrence. But Ace had her attention fixed on the two figures who were on the center of the stage. Oh, it seems we gathered quite the crowd. Judas thought as his gaze swept towards Ace, who had just arrived, Tioni, who was watching from the side, and even Bet, who leaned on the walls, pretending to be nonchalant, but the way he kept glancing at this direction every few seconds betrayed his intentions. Looking at Tiona's eager expression as she prepared herself, twirling her urga around, it seemed like she was excited. Judas, who strapped his metal gauntlets, noticed that there was something different about Tiona's weapon. Did you get it repaired? He asked with curiosity. Me and Ace paid a visit to Goibnia's shop and I happened to want to test this puppy out. Tiona said as she held up her giant sword that is even taller than her own height. And I also have been itching to fight you for some time. You know the saying, killing two birds with one rock. It's stone, but I guess it's not wrong. Judas thought after hearing her answer, but chose not to correct her, because Tiona had already gotten into her fighting stance. The courtyard gradually fell silent. Tiona planted her feet firmly against the stone. Don't hold back, okay? She said brightly. Judas exhaled slowly and rolled his shoulders. I'll do what I can, just don't complain if it doesn't go the way you expect. He replied calmly. Ha! As if. The two locked eyes. Boom! Tiona kicked off the ground, stone cracking beneath her feet as she closed the distance in an instant, urga swinging down in a wide, brutal arc meant to crush rather than cut. Since Judas had already activated his strengthening magic, he was able to respond to her moves. Judas moved to the side. His body twisted just enough for the blade to miss by a hair's breadth, the wind pressure alone sending his coat fluttering violently. Before Tiona could recover, Judas stepped in. His fist shot forward. Clang! The metal gauntlet collided with Urga's flat side, sparks flying as the massive sword was knocked off course. Ha! Tiona blinked, surprised, but her grin only widened. Nice! She twisted her grip mid-swing, spinning Urga around and sweeping low. Judas lapped. The blade passed beneath him, carving a shallow trench into the stone. As he landed, Tiona was already there. Urga came crashing down again. This time, Judas met it head-on. He crossed his arms, magic power flaring faintly as his gauntlets took the full force of the blow. Crack! The ground beneath his feet fractured outward in a spiderweb pattern. Several spectators took an involuntary step back. I endured. Judas smiled, even as his arms shook from the sheer force behind Tiona's attack. In terms of overall combat ability, Tiona did not lose out compared to Elise, Kagaya or Ace if magic is taken out of consideration. There was a reason why he was having an easier time dealing with a level 5. My stats, compared to before, they are much higher now. It was only now did he realize that his body had become stronger. Because he kept getting beaten by Althea all the same during their training, it was only now that he noticed the difference. When he fought Elise and Kaguya back then, all of his parameters were at 0, all at the lowest rank. And when he fought with Ace, his parameters averaged around 600 points each, with most of them at C rank. Now with most of his parameters almost reaching 1,000 points each, reaching A to S rank, he no longer had to strain himself just to keep up with a first-class adventurer. "Are you having fun, Judas?" Tiona questioned when she saw Judas smiling. "Yeah. I guess," he replied, which caused a huge smile to bloom on Tiona's face. "Great. Me too." After a brief conversation, the two moved and clashed again. The sparring match between them continued. Chapter 143, The Venerated 1 vs Crusher Part 2. Judas slid back several meters, boots scraping harshly against the stone as a shallow trench formed beneath his heels. Dust billowed around his feet, but despite the force behind the blow, he remained standing, shoulders squared and posture steady. He exhaled slowly. Did that repair also happen to include the Durandal attribute? He asked calmly, though a bead of sweat trickled down his temple, betraying the strain of blocking that strike had on. Tiona laughed, rolling her shoulders as if she had merely finished a warm-up. Yup. Goibnio's smithy really outdid himself. She tightened her grip on Urga, the massive double-bladed sword humming faintly as it gleamed under the sunlight. During the Loki Familia's most recent expedition, they had encountered a previously undocumented species of monster lurking in the deeper floors. Unlike most creatures of the dungeon, this one possessed a grotesque biological weapon, an acidic secretion potent enough to melt metal. To counter this newfound threat, Finn and the other executives quickly convened and reached a conclusion: their standard equipment was no longer sufficient. The solution was simple, if costly. They would reinforce their personal weapons with the Durandal attribute. The expense alone was enough to make even first-class adventurers wince. But thankfully, thanks to the enormous amount of funds they secured through extortion, through the kindness of Freya, such expenses were no longer a concern. Judas, after listening to Tiona's words, lowered his gaze to his own equipment. In particular, his eyes settled on Jarnglofer. He let out a quiet breath. Now that I have the money, I should probably upgrade my weapons and gear. The thought had been lingering in the back of his mind ever since the compensation from Freya Familia had arrived. Valis was meant to be spent, and power, especially in the dungeon, was never something to delay investing in. The deep floors. It was only a matter of time before the Loki Familia would set out on another expedition, aiming to break their record by reaching the 59th floor. With Judas being a core member and one of their strongest combatants, it was all but guaranteed that he would be placed in a dangerous but important position within the Loki Familia's formation. I could meet up with Hephaestus and see if the completed version of Jarnglofer is still possible. If not, I could always go to Goibnio's smithy. Ace, recalling their visit to the smithy in question, winced internally. She remembered all too clearly just how much Tiona had made the blacksmiths cry tears of blood. Urga was already a nightmare to work on, its sheer size and absurd weight alone were enough to test even veteran smiths. But paired with Tiona's reckless fighting style, which often left the blade chipped, cracked, or outright broken, it was no surprise that she had earned herself a reputation within the Goibnio Familia. The ultimate demon. The enemy of all blacksmiths. Ooh. You damn Amazonas. Go bite the dust. I'm so tired, boss. I can't do it anymore. Why? Why? Tell me why. Ace could still faintly hear those anguished cries echoing in her mind. She shook her head, quickly refocusing on the spar unfolding before her. In the middle of the training grounds, as dust rose all over the area, flashes of black and brown cut through the haze. Sparks were flying each time their weapons clashed. Let's turn it up a notch. Tiona grinned as her aura surged violently outward. Her muscles tightened, veins faintly bulging as she kicked off the ground and charged again, faster than before. Her movements were no longer playful. Each step cracked the stone beneath her feet as Urga came crashing down in relentless succession. Urga came at Judas from unpredictable angles, overhead strikes, horizontal sweeps, sudden feints. Judas didn't try to overpower her. Doing so would be pointless. Instead, he let each movement flow naturally. His footing was steady, his posture relaxed, almost deceptively so. Every step was measured. Every movement was economical. He deflected blows at the last possible instant, redirected Urga's massive weight with subtle shifts of his wrists, or slipped just outside the edge of her swings by mere centimeters. It wasn't strength that guided him, but timing and positioning, using the minimum effort needed to avoid the maximum force. Quickly. I have to end this quickly. Judas was fully aware of the skill Tiona possessed. Berserk. A terrifying ability that increased her physical capabilities each time she took damage. Pain only fueled her, sharpening her strikes and accelerating her momentum. Which meant that every second this fight continued was a second spent tipping the scales against him. If he allowed this to drag on, it will come to a point where he would eventually be overwhelmed. That realization settled his resolve. This match would not become a battle of endurance. He would end it in a single, decisive blow. Ace watched intently, her golden eyes tracking every exchange without blinking. Bet clicked his tongue quietly from the sidelines. TCH. At least he has a brain. Thanks to his experience, the werewolf could sense what Judas was planning. Tiona swung again, but this time, Judas parried in a way that made her lose control of her momentum. Her stance widened unnaturally, and her center of gravity shifted just slightly out of place. Got her. Judas, sensing the opportunity, had already moved. He slipped inside her guard, twisting his body as his elbow drove forward. And just as his attack was about to land, his instincts flared. This is too easy. As far as he knew, Tiona was a seasoned combat veteran, especially in close-quarters combat. Her time in Telskruya and her years as an adventurer in the Loki Familia were not for show. A cold, uneasy feeling crept up his spine. His gaze shifted upward, and his pupils shrunk. Tiona was grinning at him, as if to say, "I got you." Then he realized. That was a feint. I got tricked. Tiona twisted midair, causing his attack to miss, barely an inch from her ribs. Instead, Judas took a knee to the jaw and was promptly sent flying. If he were a normal adventurer, his defeat would have been sealed right there. Being sent backward left his arms and legs out of reach of his opponent. However, range is irrelevant to me. Even while still airborne, and with blood dripping from his lips, he raised his index finger toward Tiona, who widened her eyes as her feet touched the ground. A magic circle appeared, and a beam of compressed wind shot forward, striking her squarely in the stomach. Gwa! The force sent Tiona flying as well. Ace narrowed her eyes as she watched, and one word naturally came to her mind. Draw. Chapter 144, Tiona's Declaration. The courtyard fell silent. Those watching reached the same conclusion that Ace had made. It's a draw. While it seemed like Judas was about to lose, at the last second, he pulled through and fired a spell toward Tiona that literally sent her flying. Whether that final attack succeeded because Tiona had let her guard down, confident that victory was already hers, or because she had momentarily forgotten that Judas was, at his core, still a mage, was something only Tiona herself could answer. Either way, it was a moment worth reflecting on. Because the result was unmistakable. He drew against a first-class adventurer. Even those who had remained skeptical, those who had dismissed Judas' victory against Ace as a fluke born from favorable circumstances, had no choice but to acknowledge the truth now. A blind squirrel might find a nut once in a while. But twice in a row? At that point, calling it luck carried far less weight. TSK, the damn Amazon. Bet clicked his tongue, irritation clear on his face as he turned away. Letting herself get hit like that. There was nothing more to see here, and besides, he had something else to do, a mission with Loki to investigate the sewers, to figure out what had happened during the plant monster incident the other day. Loki, knowing that her children had gotten hurt during the attack, wouldn't let that slide. Whoever was responsible, she would make them pay. which was why she wasn't here. No one else paid attention to Bet's departure as he quietly left, their attention mostly focused on the two people kneeling on the ground. Judas, for his part, had quickly reattached his broken jaw back into place as smoke wafted from his head, his passive healing ability activating. Tiona froze as she grasped for breath, her eyes flicking down to where the strike had landed. She definitely felt it, the weight of the impact, the breath knocked from her lungs. And thus, the fight ended right there. But despite the result, she burst out laughing. Whoa! Okay. I felt that. She hopped back, lowering Urga and wiping sweat from her forehead, her grin wide and exhilarated. Man, that was fun. You really are strong, Judas. The tension dissolved, but the impression left behind lingered heavily in the air. This nitwit. Tiona let out a long breath and shook her head, watching her sister with a mixture of exasperation and reluctant relief. Sure, she had hoped Tiona would come out on top, but drawing against someone who had already beaten Ace? That wasn't a bad result. Not at all. Just as Tiona stepped forward, intent on smacking the back of her sister's head for being so carefree after letting victory slip away from her grasp just like that, her ears caught something unbelievable. I've decided. Tiona shouted the words as she thrust her finger skyward, her voice ringing across the training grounds with boundless confidence. Feeling the pain in her midsection, her instincts as an Amazon were triggered. We're going to have a rematch in the future, and if you beat me, then you'll become my mate. Her shocking declaration left everyone who heard it frozen in place, jaws hanging open in collective disbelief. There was a particular quirk about Amazons that most other races found strange. Amazons were known to often fall for any male who bested them in combat. Of course, there were certain exceptions. If the male in question wasn't to an Amazon's tastes, then no matter how thoroughly he defeated her, the chances of her becoming smitten were practically non-existent. That had been the case when Gareth defeated Tiona to make her and her sister to join the Loki Familia upon their arrival in Orario. She hadn't fallen for him, not because he lacked strength, but simply because Gareth was not a man who suited her tastes. However, things were different with Judas. A handsome young man with promising future prospects, at least, that was how Tiona saw him. But make no mistake, it wasn't an abrupt decision brought about solely by their duel or his looks, though those certainly played a part. More than anything, it was because of the actions she had witnessed with her own eyes. Not only had he helped Lafia train her concurrent chanting, but he had also supported her during the plant monster incident. Lifting her up when fear threatened to overwhelm her, helping her overcome it, and stimulating her growth as an adventurer. Tiona could see it clearly in Lafia's eyes, the admiration that filled them whenever she looked at Judas, the same gaze she reserved for Ace. And that was without even mentioning everything else, his efforts to heal the injured, his relentless drive to improve himself, and the time he willingly devoted to teaching the elven mages who sought his advice. He was respectful to those who deserved it, consistently humble in his conduct, and always willing to go out of his way to help those in need. Personality-wise, he was nearly perfect. Potential and talent? Even better. As for his looks, there was no need to elaborate. And perhaps most importantly, despite his overwhelming talent, he never grew complacent. His determination to grow stronger burned just as fiercely as ever. Simply put, Judas checked nearly every box Tiona had when it came to a potential partner. The only thing left was for him to defeat her. Of course, she had no intention of making that easy. Still, Tiona wasn't naive. She knew full well that his looks and growing popularity would inevitably draw many women to him. Hell, she wouldn't have been surprised if several members of the Familia had already fallen for him. That was precisely why she made her declaration. She wanted everyone to know. Judas was a man she was chasing. Only an Amazon could make such a bold claim without hesitation. An elf would be too proud, or too shy, to ever voice something like that so openly. As if to prove that very point, the amber-haired elf beside them struggled to process what she had just heard. Tiona, what are you saying? Lafia stammered, her face burning red as her long elven ears drooped downward. Even Tione, normally just as bold and unrestrained as her sister, was momentarily at a loss for words, her sharp eyes quietly studying Tiona's expression, searching for any hint of a joke. But there was none. Tiona's grin was genuine, and her intent was unmistakably serious. Chapter 145, Murder at Rivera. Tione could only sigh in exasperation at her little sister's antics. The urge to smack Tiona in the back of the head for making such a loud, shameless declaration was strong, almost overwhelming, but she forced herself to rein it in. Acting on it now would only make things worse. After all, wouldn't that make her a hypocrite? She, of all people, had been openly chasing after Finn without a shred of shame. An Amazon had no business lecturing another Amazon about subtlety or restraint. That was simply how they were. When an Amazon found something, or someone, they wanted, they pursued it openly, fiercely, and without hesitation. Especially when they finally found a man who caught their eye. Tione let out a quiet huff and shifted her gaze toward Judas, studying him more carefully this time. Her sharp eyes lingered for a moment longer before she nodded once, begrudging but sincere. Well, she could have done a lot worse. Her lips twitched faintly. If she had chosen Bet, I'd seriously be wondering if there was something wrong with her head. But the captain is obviously cooler, and more handsome. The smirk that formed on her face said everything. Meanwhile, Asa's reaction couldn't have been more different. Tiona. Judas, mate? She blinked. Once. Then again. Her head tilted slightly to the side as she tried to process the words she just heard. It took a few seconds, but eventually, some vague understanding settled in. And the moment it did. I don't like it. The realization came quietly, but it unsettled her deeply. There was an odd sensation in her chest. Like a knot tightening in her stomach, unfamiliar and uncomfortable. Why? Her brows furrowed. She didn't understand these feelings. They didn't make sense to her. She wasn't used to emotions that didn't have a clear source or purpose. I hope one day, you will be able to find your own hero. Her parents' voices echoed softly in her mind. Asa's gaze shifted without her even realizing it, first toward Judas, then back to Tiona, who was still grinning ear to ear, radiating excitement. She liked Tiona. She trusted her. She considered her a dear friend and comrade. But for some reason, looking at her like this made something twist unpleasantly inside her. No. She shook her head sharply, as if physically forcing the thoughts away. I want to eat a lot of Jayagamarican. Her mind latched onto the thought desperately. Crispy fried potatoes. Warm. Comforting. Anything to distract her from whatever that feeling was. Nearby, Lafia was completely overwhelmed. Her face was burning red, her eyes replaced with swirling symbols as she mumbled incoherent nonsense under her breath. Around them, the rest of the crowd erupted into murmurs. Gasps, whispers, and overlapping voices rippled through the training grounds as members of the Loki Familia turned toward Tiona with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to outright excitement. This was definitely going to spread. High above, watching from the window of the main office, Gareth let out a booming chuckle. Oh. Sounds like I just heard something interesting. He crossed his arms and glanced sideways. Oi, Finn. Looks like someone's finally gonna share your suffering. The dwarf grinned widely as he teased the Paolum captain seated at the desk. Finn laughed lightly in response. Ha ha. Judas, good luck. His tone was relaxed. But inside, his sharp mind was already racing, rapidly reassessing the complications this development might bring to the Familia. Rivera, who had been reviewing documents, lifted her head at the noise. She walked to the window and gazed outside before letting out a long sigh. These young ladies really should learn some restraint. She pinched the bridge of her nose, already feeling a headache forming. As for the person at the center of it all, Judas had just finished wiping the blood from the corner of his mouth when his expression froze completely. Slowly, very slowly, he lifted his head. Ha! He stood there, utterly dumbfounded. Even back when Lyra and Kagaya teased him during their time as a party, he'd barely reacted, because that was all it had ever been. Just teasing. This, however, was different. He had been caught so completely off guard that his mind stalled, taking far longer than usual to even begin processing what had just been said. Meanwhile, last night, in the small town of Rivera, located on the 18th floor of the dungeon, a man clad in armor and a woman wearing a robe entered the inn together. After paying for their rooms, the armored man casually draped an arm around the woman's shoulders. The innkeeper, catching sight of the gesture, couldn't help but let out a lewd grin. A man and a woman, alone in a room. It was obvious at a glance what they were about to do. This lucky bastard. The innkeeper thought as his eyes lingered on the woman's curvy figure. Even beneath her loose clothing, her shape was impossible to hide. He gave the armored man a knowing salute. The man returned it with a thumbs up. Once inside the room, impatience quickly overtook him. He stripped off his armor in a hurry, and within seconds, he was already half naked. Sitting on the bed, he shifted his gaze toward the woman, whose back was still turned to him, and spoke. "Oi, hurry up and strip. Don't leave me hanging after coming this far." Hearing his words, the woman grinned and smoothly slipped out of her robe. "Wait, don't be hasty," she said as the fabric fell to the floor, her bare skin and figure fully revealed. The man inhaled sharply, admiring her for a few moments as a lewd grin spread across his face. "Why are you hiding your face when you're so pretty?" he asked, grabbing her by the hips and pulling her onto the bed. "So I don't get involved with every man, like you," the woman replied calmly. As he pushed her down, she continued, her fingers gently brushing his cheek. "Now, can you tell me more about the mission you took?" The man barely spared the question a thought. Whether it was the mood or sheer arrogance, he answered without hesitation. "Yeah, it was a weird one," he muttered. "They told me to go down to the 30th floor and bring back some strange object." He paused, then laughed awkwardly. "Ah, that was supposed to be super top secret. Think you can forget you ever heard that?" A faint smirk tugged at the woman's lips. "Don't worry," she said softly. "I'll take that secret to your grave." Her voice turned cold. The man frowned. "Don't you mean to my grave?" "Exactly." Her hand suddenly wrapped around his neck and tightened. GGK. Realizing this was not the kind of choking he had anticipated, the man thrashed wildly, veins bulging as he struggled to pry her fingers away. The woman merely scoffed at his futile resistance. With a sharp twist of her arm. Crack! The sound echoed through the room as his neck snapped. She discarded the corpse like a piece of trash. Her gaze immediately shifted to the man's bag. Rifling through it, her expression darkened. "It's not here." Narrowing her eyes, she turned back toward the body. With a cold snort, she raised her foot and stomped down, crushing his head completely. Chapter 146, Stressed Ace. On the 15th floor of the dungeon, Judas walked through the dimly lit corridors with a leisurely stride. The faint glow of luminous moss clinging to the walls cast long, warped shadows across the stone, stretching and shrinking with each step he took. Today, he had decided to descend into the dungeon for reasons unrelated to Valis. It wasn't for training. Nor was it to gain experience. It was for something far simpler. "It's good to come here, to clear my head after all the shenanigans earlier." Judas exhaled slowly. The dungeon, for all its dangers, had a strange way of quieting his mind. Crack! His ears twitched. The sound came from the wall to his right, stone fracturing, something forcing its way through. Roar! With a violent burst, a monster tore free from the dungeon wall, shards of rock scattering as it landed on the ground, its roar filled with raw hostility. A Lidgerfang. Judas identified it instantly. A massive tiger-like monster, its muscles coiled beneath striped fur, fangs dripping with saliva. On these floors, it was one of the apex predators, overall not inferior to a minotaur in terms of raw power. A monster that commonly spawned between the 15th and 17th floors. For most adventurers, an ambush like this would have meant an immediate, frantic battle. Judas didn't even flinch. He didn't spare the monster more than a glance. The moment the Ligerfang took a single step forward, Judas casually swiped his hand. A prepared spell discharged instantly, a blade of condensed energy tearing through the air with a sharp whistle. Slash! The Ligerfang was split cleanly from top to bottom. There wasn't even time for it to react. Its massive body froze for a heartbeat before crumbling into ash, scattering across the dungeon floor. Silence returned. At the edge of his vision, Judas spotted the remains left behind, a gleaming mana stone, and beside it, a thin layer of cloth-like material. Ligerfang fur. With a thought, Judas activated his telekinesis. The mana stone and fur lifted gently from the ground and floated into his open bag. Though he was, by all accounts, obscenely wealthy now, that didn't mean he would ignore loot found in the dungeon. Part of it was simply his nature, he disliked wasting anything. But more importantly, leaving mana stones behind was dangerous. A monster that consumed another monster's mana stone could grow stronger, mutate, or even give rise to an irregular or enhanced species. If that happened, and an unprepared adventurer party stumbled upon it, people would die. That lesson had been drilled into him early on, one of the first things any adventurer learned when stepping into the dungeon for the first time, whether from an advisor, a senior familia member, or through grim experience. Just as Judas finished tucking the magic stone and Ligerfang fur into his bag and took a step forward. Crunch! A loud, unmistakable sound echoed from behind him. Ace. He turned his head just in time to see the blonde swordswoman calmly munching on a Jayagamarakan, her cheeks puffed slightly as she chewed. His gaze drifted downward to the paper bag she was holding. It's almost empty. When they had first entered the dungeon, that bag had been filled to the brim with fried potatoes. Yet Ace had demolished them at such a terrifying pace that even Judas, someone who had seen all manner of absurd feats, briefly entertained the thought that she could enter a Jayagamarakan eating contest and win by an overwhelming margin. Is she stress eating? As they descended through the dungeon floors, Ace had done little besides eat. She hadn't drawn her sword once. That was because she didn't need to. Judas had been the one handling every monster unfortunate enough to cross their path, dispatching them with clean, efficient movements before they could even pose a threat. When he had asked why she decided to come with him in the first place. Because I want to? She had answered while tilting her head, her expression utterly innocent. Judas hadn't pressed the matter after that. They simply continued downward. However, there was one more person accompanying them, someone Judas hadn't expected to join them. Is that the telekinesis magic Lafia told me about? How convenient. Riveria's calm voice rang out as she observed him from behind, her sharp eyes lingering briefly on the items floating into his bag earlier. She sounded genuinely impressed. Judas didn't bother asking why she was here. She's worried about Ace. He had been around long enough to understand that, while Riveria cared deeply for all members of the Loki familia, her concern for Ace went far beyond that. If the others were children under her guidance, then Ace was the daughter she watched over most closely. Whenever it came to Ace, Riveria's so-called mama mode activated without fail, a fact Loki never missed an opportunity to tease her about. Which, in turn, always earned Loki a sharp smack on the head with Riveria's staff. Thus, without any formal discussion or declaration, a temporary party had been formed. Judas, Ace, and Riveria were already at the 17th floor, huh? Judas glanced around as another monster's body dissolved into ash and magic stones clattered against the dungeon floor. Thanks to your magic, we don't even have to pause to collect the loot. Riveria's voice was calm as ever, even as she stepped forward and drove the pointed end of her staff cleanly through a minotaur's throat. The massive creature stiffened, eyes bulging, before collapsing with a heavy thud. With a small flick of her wrist, the corpse began to fade, its magic stone and drops already drifting toward Judas under the influence of his telekinesis. I truly wish you had joined the Familia sooner. Riveria continued, her tone uncharacteristically candid. Having you on our previous expeditions would have made things considerably easier. It wasn't flattery. It was an honest assessment. Thanks. Judas responded with a faint smile and an appreciative nod, his focus never leaving the battlefield as the materials were neatly stored away. Well, monsters in the middle floors are barely a challenge. He said it casually, almost offhandedly, as Ace stepped past him and cleaved another minotaur clean in half. Her blade flashed, and the monster didn't even have time to roar before it split apart. It seems like she's all better now. He could tell just by watching her movements. Her swings were sharp, precise, free of hesitation. Whatever had been weighing on her earlier had already faded away. For Ace, it seemed that a few clean kills and the familiar rhythm of combat were all it took to steady her heart. From there, their descent was swift. Floor after floor passed without incident, the trio cutting through monsters with frightening efficiency. It didn't take long before they reached the 18th floor. Since they were well aware that the Goliath wouldn't spawn this time, breezing past the 17th floor posed no issue at all. And even if it had appeared, with this lineup, it would have been nothing more than a very large punching bag. The moment they stepped onto the 18th floor, the oppressive atmosphere of the dungeon vanished. They were greeted instead by a vast, lush expanse, towering trees, flowing streams, and greenery that felt almost surreal after the stone corridors above. Artificial sunlight filtered down from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the land. Following the marked path, Judas and the others soon arrived at their destination. The town of Rivera. It's been a while since I've been here. Riveria lifted her gaze toward the wooden structure at the entrance, her eyes settling on the carved text displayed prominently above it. 334th. That single number told a story. It meant Rivera had been destroyed and rebuilt over 300 times by now. The resilience, and stubborn dedication, of the people who maintained this place was nothing short of remarkable. Even though the 18th floor was considered a safe zone, monsters would occasionally crawl up from below and wreak havoc. When that happened, the adventurers of Rivera would either fight back or retreat. And once things settled down, they returned and rebuilt everything that was lost. As Judas, Ace, and Riveria walked through the town, they quickly noticed something was off. The usual liveliness was muted. Conversations were hushed. Groups of adventurers stood clustered together, whispering among themselves. The atmosphere in this town is a bit strange. Riveria voiced the thought as her sharp eyes swept across the surroundings. It didn't take long for the reason to reveal itself. Is it true there was a murder? Yeah. It happened at Viri's Inn. People are already gathering there. The trio exchanged glances. Silence lingered for a brief moment before Riveria spoke. Let's go take a look. Without another word, they changed course and headed toward Viri's Inn. Chapter 147, Murder Mystery. After asking a passersby for directions, they finally found the location of Viri's Inn. When they arrived, a huge crowd had gathered at the entrance, people jostling and shouting over one another, creating a chaotic wall of humanity. Excuse me, let me through. Judas muttered as he tried to squeeze into the mass of bodies. But it was like pushing against an iron wall. No one seemed willing to budge even an inch. We can't get through like this, Riveria said with a resigned expression. Judas tried again, shoving a little to the left, then the right, but it was futile. Just as Ace was preparing to leap over the crowd, her mind already calculating the trajectory. Fine. Judas had run out of patience. With a calm exhale, he extended his arm. His telekinesis magic rippled outward, and the entire crowd was suddenly lifted and swept aside. People stumbled, scrambled, and shouted as they were gently, but firmly, pushed back in two directions. It was as though Moses himself had appeared, parting the sea, only this time the sea consisted entirely of adventurers. That is one way of getting through, Riveria muttered, glancing briefly at Judas in mild surprise. Ace, who was about to jump, stopped mid-motion and blinked a couple of times at this spectacle, but didn't say anything. Ha! Hey! What the? Voices of confusion echoed in a cacophony among the crowd of adventurers as Judas moved them with his telekinesis. Who's using magic? Come out and show yourself. You wanna get beaten up? Some of the more hot-headed individuals attempted to push forward, shoving through the crowd in a show of defiance. But as their eyes fell on Judas, Ace, and Riveria, walking calmly, unfazed, like they were strolling through a quiet park, a flicker of recognition flashed across their faces. Abruptly, their mouths clamped shut. The Loki Familia? Only a fool, or someone recklessly confident in their own power, would dare pick a fight with one of the top familias in Orario. These were seasoned adventurers who had explored the dungeon for many years, not mindless side characters from some cultivation novel who would start fights over petty slights. Wisely, they held their anger. Slowly, mutters and curses faded, replaced by cautious whispers as they gave way. The crowd now formed a clear path. When they entered the inn, Judas, Ace, and Riveria, with their enhanced senses, immediately picked up a foul stench. Someone had died here. The familiar smell of a corpse. As they stepped into the room where the crime had occurred, their eyes were greeted by a body whose head had been completely turned into meat paste. How awful. Riveria commented, covering her nose. Judas even spotted an eyeball that had been flung some distance away. Huh? What the? The Loki Familia? Why are you guys here? Damn it. What the hell is the watch doing? A man spoke as he roughly scratched his head. Judas shifted his gaze toward him. He was a human with a rugged face, wearing an eye patch over his left eye. His name was Borselda, a level 3 adventurer and the de facto leader of the town of Rivera. Bors, what happened here? Riveria asked, averting her eyes from the corpse and turning toward him instead. TSK, damn. Whether it's you guys or the Freya Familia, strong folks like you really just do whatever you want, huh? Bors said, crossing his arms. Well, as you can see, someone here went back to heaven. I suspect this murder happened last night. He continued while staring at the corpse, shaking his head. Bors then turned toward a figure seated on the bed, the owner of the inn, holding his head in both hands. A beastkin named Viri. Oi, Viri. You're the owner of this place. Explain what happened. Hearing Bors's words, Viri raised his head and spoke, a bead of sweat trailing down his face. From what I remember last night, the guy who was killed was wearing full plate armor. His face was covered by a helmet, so I don't know what he looked like. Viri let out an exasperated sigh. And I remember he was with a woman wearing a robe, she was hiding her face too. In particular, the two of them asked me to rent out the entire inn. Hearing this, Riveria furrowed her brows. The implications of Viri's words were clear, but she chose not to comment. Question mark. Meanwhile, Ace wore a puzzled expression, wondering why anyone would rent an entire inn. I didn't have any reason to turn them away as long as I got paid. Then, the next day, I found the same man dead on the floor. Just thinking about it gives me chills. Viri continued, his body shivering slightly. In other words, that woman is most likely the culprit. Bors concluded after hearing Viri's account. We can't make such a hasty conclusion, Riveria interjected, her fingers touching her chin. But I suppose the biggest suspect would indeed be that woman. Bors, we got it. At that moment, a few of Bors's subordinates entered the room, one of them holding a potion. That is? Judas muttered, frowning at the unfamiliar bottle. A status thief, an item used solely to reveal someone's status. Riveria explained. They watched as one of the men uncorked the bottle and poured a single drop onto the corpse's back. Judging by how pathetically he died, he's probably just some low-level grunt from a low-level familia. Bors voiced his assumption, and several others nodded in agreement. Judas watched as the falna on the corpse's back magically appeared. However, because he had not learned the god's language of this world, he couldn't read it. That was why Riveria stepped forward and read it aloud. His name is Hashana Dorlia, and his affiliation is the Ganesha Familia. Ace spoke the final words. Her ability to read the hieroglyphs was thanks to the painstaking lessons Riveria had drilled into her when she was younger. Wait a minute. Did you just say Hashana? Hashana as in the hard fist fighter? Borsa's single eye widened in disbelief. His mouth hung open, beads of sweat forming on his face. This guy isn't some low-level grunt, he's a level 4. Neither Judas nor the others rebuked Bors for his shock. They too furrowed their brows at the revelation. What did a level 4 signify? Even if they weren't first-class powerhouses, a level 4 was still a high-level combatant, someone capable of tipping the balance of power in a middle or even upper-middle-class familia. Outside of Rio and the school district, how many level 4s even existed? Judas would estimate fewer than the fingers on one hand. A level 3 was already enough to serve as an Imperial Knight Commander of the Empire. For someone of that caliber to die in such a manner, the culprit would have to be at least level 4 as well. But considering the complete lack of struggle or signs of battle in the room, there was only one conclusion. The killer is most likely level 5 or higher. Judas muttered under his breath. In a narrow, dimly lit alleyway in Rivera, a female beastkin stood pressed against the cold stone wall, clutching a worn bag tightly against her chest. Her ears twitched at every distant footstep, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow as if expecting something to leap out at any moment. Only after several long seconds passed without incident did she finally let out a shaky breath. The coast is clear. She pushed off the wall and broke into a sprint, intent on leaving Rivera as quickly as possible. But what she failed to realize was that she had never truly been alone. From the depths of the alley's shadows, a lone figure clad in dark-colored armor watched her every movement in silence. The figure blinked once, and vanished like a ghost. Chapter 148, Give Chase. A level 4 second-class adventurer had been murdered in Rivera. That fact alone was enough to send ripples through the town. Level 4s weren't common rabble, even within Rio, they were considered powerhouses. And yet, one of them had been killed so thoroughly that there wasn't even a chance to fight back. The suspected culprit was a woman believed to be at least a first-class adventurer. Anyone who had reached level 5 or higher should have been well known by now. Whether within Rio or across the surface world, first-class adventurers were figures of great reputation, famous all around the world. Among all the known first-class adventurers in Rio, there were only around 40. In theory, that alone should have drastically narrowed the list of suspects. And yet, Judas had a strong hunch that none of them were responsible. Looking at the corpse's injuries, his neck was completely snapped. Judas thought, his gaze lingering on the grotesquely ruined corpse. More importantly, the victim has abnormal resistance. Poison or cheap tricks wouldn't have worked. Which meant the murderer relied on overwhelming physical force and absolute confidence, enough to kill a level 4 in a single motion. As he and the others continued to search the room for clues, Judas's thoughts spun. The longer he examined the scene, the more a picture began to form in his mind. After a few minutes of looking around, Hasharna took a job and went down to the 30th floor, to retrieve something the murderer wanted. In his hand was a blood-soaked piece of paper. What was left of a quest notice? Most of the ink had been ruined, smeared beyond recognition, but a few fragments remained legible. Bors, for now, close off the town. Don't let anyone leave, not even a fly. Riveria said as she straightened up. Although Bors didn't like taking orders, he understood the seriousness of the situation and complied. Got it. He turned his head toward his subordinates. You lot. Close off the north and south gates. After that, gather all the adventurers in town in one place. He paused briefly before adding. If anyone resists, treat them as a suspect and tie them up on the spot. His subordinates snapped to attention, nodded, and quickly went off to carry out their orders. As everyone began to move, Judas suddenly felt his instincts flare. For some reason, why do I feel like the plant monster incident and this murder scene are connected? His intuition had almost never been wrong, and that thought alone was enough to make him frown. Yeah, something like this definitely wasn't shown in the anime. Unbeknownst to him, Judas was already being drawn into the events of Sword Oratoria, a different perspective of the story, a spin-off he hadn't known about. A couple of minutes passed, and at the center of the town of Rivera, a massive crowd had already gathered. Adventurers of all shapes and sizes filled the open plaza. Some armed, some injured, others visibly irritated at being summoned so abruptly. Low murmurs rippled through the crowd, suspicion and unease hanging thick in the air. "That was quick," Riveria muttered as she looked down at the scene below. "We threatened to blacklist them from entering Rivera if they didn't comply," Boris replied with a confident snort. "Of course they'd come running." Riveria's gaze slowly swept over the gathering, sharp and calculating. "This enemy intended to cause a disturbance," she said calmly. "She's most likely disguising herself, or has concealed her true level." Boris crossed his arms, clicking his tongue. "Yeah, but that still leaves us with a problem," he said. "How exactly do we pick out a first-class adventurer from this mess?" At that moment, Judas took a step forward. Riveria noticed immediately, but said nothing. Ace, who understood his abilities better than most, also remained silent. "What kind of magic is he about to use?" The High Elf Princess watched him closely, curiosity flickering in her eyes. While Riveria and Ace focused on Judas, Boris looked at him with faint confusion. This kid. Boris had heard of Judas Spade, how could he not? The Loki Familia's sensational rookie, a name that had spread through the entire city despite the boy having been an adventurer for barely 3 weeks. Still, knowing a name and recognizing a face were two different things. Seeing Judas standing beside Riveria and Ace, Boris instinctively assumed he was a lower-ranked member, or perhaps even just a supporter. He glanced at Riveria. When she offered no objection, Boris held his tongue. "Hey, that boy looks familiar." As Judas stepped forward, a few adventurers in the crowd began to murmur, recognition dawning on their faces. Judas ignored them. He closed his eyes. In the next instant, the air itself seemed to stir. Magic power surged outward in a controlled wave, subtle yet unmistakable to anyone sensitive to magic. When Judas opened his eyes again, his pupils had shifted from deep purple to radiant gold. A magic circle flared to life beneath his feet. An invisible pulse swept through the area, silent, fast, and all-encompassing. What the hell, was that detection magic? Several mages in the crowd exclaimed, their voices overlapping. Incredible! Riveria's eyes widened slightly. It was subtle, but in that brief moment, he cast multiple spells simultaneously. Ace tilted her head. His eyes changed color. Gold, just like mine. In Judas' vision, the world was layered with light. Countless colorful motes drifted through the air, life force made visible, clinging to plants, seeping from the ground, and surrounding every person in the town like faint halos. Some glowed weakly, others burned brighter, but all followed a familiar pattern. Judas scanned them one by one. Not here? It was then that his brows knit together as he looked down. Why are there so many faint life signatures hidden underground? In his vision, he spotted small clusters of life energy buried beneath the soil, and they were everywhere. Hidden monsters? For some reason, his instincts were telling him that these things were dangerous, that he shouldn't leave them alone. Maybe later, for now, the priority should be the murderer. He pushed the information to the back of his mind and focused, driving his senses further. Magic power surged through his perception as he forcibly expanded it, stretching outward until it engulfed the entirety of Rivera, and then extended even beyond its walls. The town faded from focus as the range continued to widen, brushing past the outskirts, the surrounding forest paths, and the routes leading away from the town. Then, found you. His gaze locked onto it. Far in the distance, a single presence burned unnaturally bright, its life force far denser than anything nearby, standing out like a beacon against the muted glow of the world. Ha, ha, ha. Outside Rivera, a lone figure sprinted through the terrain, her ragged breaths echoing in her ears. A female beastkin clutched a bag tightly against her chest as she ran, her body pushed well past its limits. Black hair clung to her sweat-soaked face, brown eyes wide with panic. Light brown Chianthrope ears twitched atop her head, flattened in fear, while her tail flicked erratically behind her. She wore brown shorts, matching boots, and a fitted jacket, a crimson scarf fluttering wildly with every step. Her name was Lillian Louis, a level 3 adventurer of the Hermes Familia. I have to get out of here. Her thoughts screamed as she forced her legs to move faster, lungs burning with every breath. Why did I accept this stupid mission? Frustration and fear twisted together in her chest, and then she stopped. Her heels dug into the ground as she skidded to a halt, dirt spraying forward. Her sensitive beastkin ears had picked it up. Footsteps. Closing in. Her blood ran cold. Shit, they already found me. Sweat poured down her face as her heart slammed violently against her ribs. She didn't think, she bolted, turning and sprinting blindly in another direction. But it was pointless. A shadow fell over her. Ha! Her breath caught. Slowly, hesitantly, Lillian lifted her head. Standing several steps ahead of her was a figure clad in armor, unmoving, silent, watching her with a gaze so cold it sent a chill straight down her spine. Her legs trembled. I'm dead. Chapter 149, Confrontation. Is this the person who killed Hasharna? The thought surfaced in her mind, and Lillian instinctively took a step back. Standing before her was someone who had brutally slaughtered a level 4 adventurer. Someone an entire rank above her, with terrifying ease. Her throat went dry. Don't tell me. I am next? Color drained from her face as the realization settled in. Her fingers trembled around the bag clutched to her chest, knuckles turning white from how tightly she held on. This was the worst possible scenario she could have imagined, and it had come true. I didn't think the item Hasharna gave me would attract this much trouble. What was supposed to be a simple delivery mission, quick, clean, and uneventful, had spiraled into a nightmare where her death felt all but inevitable. The armored figure said nothing. Yet the gaze she felt bore down on her like a verdict already passed, as though she were nothing more than a corpse that simply hadn't fallen yet. A cold, mechanical click echoed as the armored figure took a single step forward. Lillian's breath hitched violently. Every instinct screamed at her to run. To flee, to survive, but her legs refused to respond, rooted in place as if the ground itself had seized her ankles. Take it. The words burst from her before she could stop them, her voice cracking as she thrust the bag forward with trembling hands. You were after this, right? I don't care anymore, Jay, just take it and let me go. Whatever the case, her life was more important than whatever monetary reward this mission had offered. But the figure didn't answer. That silence was worse than any threat. Before Lillian even realized what was happening, the armored figure had already closed the distance, moving so fast that her vision could barely track it. In the blink of an eye, the tip of a sword hovered mere inches from her head. Her breath caught in her throat. This is it. Earth Wall. It was then that an unknown voice reached their ears. One moment, Lillian was staring at a blade about to pierce her skull, and the next, a wall of earth erupted between her and the attacker. The sudden shift left her mind blank. Her strength gave out, and she collapsed backward, landing hard on her butt. Sweat drenched her body as her heart pounded so violently she thought it might burst from her chest. Almost instinctively, both she and the armored figure turned their heads at the same time toward the source of the spell. Black hair and purple eyes, there stood a figure clad in lightweight armor, whose metal gloves glowed faintly as dense magic power wrapped around them. J. Judas S. Spade? Lillian said with a stutter, her eyes wide in recognition. The very person Hermes, her god, had been paying the most attention to recently. Judas briefly glanced at Lillian, his eyes lingering on the bag she was clutching for dear life. A faint crease formed between his brows. Why do I feel uncomfortable? Something inside that bag radiated an unpleasant presence, subtle yet deeply wrong. It wasn't evil in the usual sense, it felt distorted, almost hostile. But he didn't have time to dwell on it. Judas shifted his focus back to the armored figure. Above level 5. And somewhere just below level 6. The assessment came instantly. The armored individual turned their head and stared straight into Judas' purple eyes through the slit in the helmet. Several seconds of silence passed. Judas could feel it, a dense concentration of malice, the unmistakable scent of death clinging to the person's aura. This was the kind of aura only someone who had killed recently could possess. It will be dangerous. Despite having recently won his rematch against the executives of the Freya Familia, Judas didn't grow conceited. He knew better than to overestimate himself. That victory had only been possible because the circumstances had been overwhelmingly in his favor. In a real fight. No restrictions, no advantages, in his current state, he still had a long way to go before he could truly face a level 6 head-on. If I fight directly, if I want to win, I'd have to sacrifice a limb or two. His body shifted into a stance just as the armored figure moved. The enemy charged. Despite wearing heavy armor that should have hindered their movements, the speed at which they closed the distance was monstrous, far beyond any level 5 Judas had ever encountered. But he didn't panic. Raising his index finger calmly, Judas formed a magic circle at the tip of his fingertip. Of course, that's only if I'm alone. A golden blur intercepted the sword just before it could reach his midsection. Metal clashed violently as sparks flew. At the same time, Judas fired his spell. Lightning Spear. Blue lightning erupted with a deafening crack of thunder. A massive bolt, shaped like a spear, tore through the air and slammed into the enemy, sending her flying. Ace. You think we can take her on? Judas asked as he glanced at the golden-haired girl, her sword already drawn. Men, she's strong. It'll be hard, but I think we can take her. Ace replied with a firm nod. Hearing her answer, Judas turned his gaze to the beastkin girl, who was still too terrified to move. Barrier. A circular barrier manifested instantly, surrounding Lillian. Ha! What is this? Barrier magic? Lillian asked, looking around in panic. Don't run away. We have questions for you after this is over, Judas said before turning back to the enemy. Ha! Isn't it already over? Lillian asked, confused. Judas didn't respond. Seeing this, Lillian followed his gaze. From within the lingering smoke, the armored enemy emerged. Blue sparks still danced erratically around her arms as she grasped the massive lightning spear, its crackling form struggling violently against her grip. For a brief moment, the spell screamed, then her fingers tightened. The lightning shattered. Magic dispersed into harmless motes of light, fading into the air as if it had never existed. Seeing this, Judas and Ace expressions hardened. Are you the one who killed Hasharna? Ace asked, pointing her sword forward. And if I was? The armored enemy finally spoke. Her voice was unmistakably feminine as she began removing her armor piece by piece. Heavy metallic thuds echoed as each piece hit the ground. But the most disturbing sight came when she reached for her face. She began peeling the skin away. Did you know? If you apply the fluids of a poison vermis to someone's skin, it stops decay, she said calmly as she completely tore off the skin mask. Then that means, that face belonged to Hasharna. Lillian whispered, her eyes widening in horror. Ah, shit. That was tight and uncomfortable. Now fully revealed, Judas took in her appearance. Blood-red hair. Green eyes. A cold, emotionless expression. My name is Rivas, she declared as an overwhelming wave of bloodlust flooded the area. All of you will die by my hands. Chapter 150, The Sword Princess vs. Rivas Part 1. Rivas did not waste any more words. The moment she declared their deaths, she raised 2 fingers to her mouth and let out a sharp, piercing whistle. Fui! Come out! The shrill, kettle-like sound echoed unnaturally through the air, lingering far longer than it should have. Almost instantly, the atmosphere around the 18th floor shifted. A deep boom thundered in the distance. When Judas and the others turned their heads, their expressions hardened. they saw the town of Rivera suddenly become surrounded by a swarm of plant monsters, bursting up from beneath the ground. Stone cracked and soil exploded outward as thick roots tore through the surface, splitting the earth apart. Twisted vines and thorn-covered limbs dragged grotesque bodies into the open, their movements accompanied by wet, grinding sounds. Some emerged from alleyways, others from beneath buildings and walkways, their massive forms forcing cobblestone streets to buckle and collapse. "What is those things?" Lillian whispered, her voice trembling as she stared at the overwhelming sight. Meanwhile, inside Rivera, chaos erupted. Adventurers shouted. The sudden appearance of monsters within the town caught everyone completely off guard. "I will not forgive whoever let these monsters through," Borse roared, sweat streaming down his face as he drew his weapon. "How the hell did these freaks even get here?" His voice barely carried over the din of panic and destruction. "This has gotten out of hand." Rivera stood amidst the turmoil, her sharp eyes scanning the battlefield with grim focus. "Aren't these the same plant monsters Ace, Judas, and the others fought a few days ago?" "Judas. You were right. Thank goodness I listened." Just minutes earlier, right after Judas had pinpointed Reva's location. "Rivera. I sense something dangerous hiding underground," Judas had said urgently. "Can you stay here, just in case?" Before she could even question him, he and Ace had already taken off, their figures vanishing into the distance as they pursued the murderer. There hadn't been time for him to explain the clusters of faint life force buried beneath the town. He didn't need to. Judas had said those words trusting she would understand. And she did. Though they had known each other for only a short time, Rivera had learned one thing: Judas never spoke lightly. If he labeled something dangerous, it meant exactly that. So she stayed behind. She chose to trust him. "Although, this is the first time someone other than Finn or Gareth has given me an order like that." A faint, almost amused thought crossed her mind. Thankfully, Rivera was not so prideful as to dismiss his warning simply because he was younger, or a junior member. "Rohar!" A shrill screech pierced her sharp elven ears. Rivera snapped back to reality just in time to see a plant monster charging straight at her, its jagged maw opening wide, vines coiling as it lunged. She didn't hesitate. With a sharp twist of her body, Rivera swung her staff and struck the creature squarely on the side of its head. Crack! The monster was sent flying, smashing into another of its kind and crushing it beneath its bulk, incidentally saving an adventurer who had been frozen in fear. At the very least, level 3. Possibly level 4. Despite her poor physical stats as a mage, Rivera was still a level 6 with tons of accumulated experience. Her close combat ability was nothing to scoff at. This can't be a coincidence. Her mind raced as she observed the battlefield. The timing of the murderer's appearance. And these plant monsters surfacing simultaneously. The conclusion was unavoidable. Though she wasn't as meticulous and astute as Finn, her intellect was no less sharp. "The killer is a tamer," Rivera said firmly, already moving to engage the next threat. Or at the very least, someone capable of controlling these monsters. With that realization, the High Elf Princess surged back into battle, her staff glowing faintly as magic gathered around her. Back to Judas and the others. Seeing the destruction unfold in the distance, Judas let out a deep frown. From where they stood, the chaos in Rivera was impossible to miss: explosions of earth, flashes of magic, and panicked shouts echoing faintly through the air. It had all happened far too fast, so fast that there hadn't been time to properly respond before the situation spiraled out of control. Thankfully, I was cautious enough and left Rivera there, but even then, the situation is still dire. Judas turned his head. It wasn't just Rivera. All around them, the ground churned and split open as plant monsters emerged one after another, their grotesque forms crawling out from beneath the soil. "We're surrounded." His pupils flicked from left to right, scanning their surroundings. No matter where he looked, there was no clear path left. They were completely encircled by the same plant monsters that had attacked the city a few days ago. Now. Reva's voice cut cleanly through the tension. All preparations had been completed. She stepped forward, her movements unhurried, and reached down to grasp the sword that had been embedded into the ground. The moment her fingers wrapped around the hilt, she pulled it free with ease. "I will take that jewel, even if I have to take it from your corpses." The instant those words left her lips, her figure vanished. She became nothing more than a blur. She's so fast!" Lillian exclaimed, her eyes failing to track the enemy's movement at all. Above, Ace, who had remained perfectly composed in her stance, tilted her head upward. There, Rivas was already in the air. With her sword raised high, she swung it downward with terrifying force, the air itself screaming under the weight of her strike. Ace grit her teeth as she braced herself. The force behind Rivas' downward strike was monstrous. Far heavier than anything a normal first-class adventurer should be capable of. Crack! The ground beneath Ace's feet shattered completely, spiderweb cracks racing outward as chunks of stone were blasted into the air. Ace was nearly forced down onto one knee, her arms trembling as she barely managed to hold the blow back. So heavy. Before she could recover, Rivas twisted her wrist mid-swing, her blade changing trajectory in an instant as she followed up with a sharp kick aimed straight for Ace's head. Ace reacted on pure instinct. She shifted her head to the side just in time, the kick slicing through the air where her face had been a split second earlier. "Looks like you are strong." Rivas' voice was cold and flat, devoid of surprise or admiration, only acknowledgement. Ace didn't respond. She stepped in and swung her sword toward her enemy, her expression as calm and focused as ever. What followed was a relentless exchange. Steel met steel again and again, the sound of metal clashing ringing sharply through the air as their blades collided. Sparks flew with each impact, their movements so fast that they blurred together, neither side willing to give an inch. For several seconds, the two traded strikes without pause, slashes, parries, feints. Each attack flowing seamlessly into the next. Watching from the sidelines, Lillian felt her head spin, her eyes struggling to keep up with their movements. While Ace thrust her sword forward, Rivas suddenly slipped inside her range, abandoning her blade entirely as she drove a punch straight toward Ace's head. Ace reacted instantly, shifting her stance and raising her arm to block. The blow landed. Even through the guard, the sheer force behind it sent Ace flying backward. She's strong. Very strong. Using the recoil, Ace flipped backward through the air, twisting her body to regain balance. She landed several meters away, boots digging into the dirt as she slid to a stop. How can there be an adventurer this strong, and I've never heard of her? A dull ache throbbed through her arms, making it painfully clear, this opponent was far stronger than she had first assumed. That wraps up this part of What If a Venerated Soul Reincarnated in Danmachi World. Thanks so much for listening. As always, new parts drop every 4 days, so be sure to stay tuned. Also check out my Patreon channel for early releases of all the series, where you can find all the series released one day ahead of YouTube. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, share it with your friends, and please consider supporting the original author as well. See you in the next one.